I know it's a cliche, but it's also true that the only constant in our world is change. Everything is temporary. And this is something that's always on my mind. It's probably why I love watching those time lapses that speed up the evolution or decay of an ecosystem or an object. Because this process is happening with everything from our fleeting thoughts to the seasons changing to our lifetimes and even our planet on a cosmic timescale. It's always changing. What emerges always fades into something else that emerges and fades in a continuous cycle. And it always reminds me of this story of a monk who was asked what he learned in like 30 or 40 years of being a monk. And he said, "I've learned only one thing. All that arises passes away." I know it's futile, but I always want to fight this. I always want to bottle things that I know will be gone soon. This is why I take a lot of photos, why I journal so much. It's why I love wine, which is literally the bottling of a unique place at a specific time in a way that is magical to me. And it's especially why I love art, because art allows us to capture a particular artist at a particular time in a particular place. Art has a way of freezing that moment of creativity for centuries or millennia. And you can go to a museum and experience things that were created at a time that no longer exists, in a faraway place that no longer exists in the same way by an individual who's no longer here, but yet everything that was then is here now before you. And I find that to be such a valuable experience. So with all of that kind of swirling around in my mind, one day I had the idea of creating a work of art that would literally preserve objects, fruits and vegetables, kind of like wine, but in a more visual format. Specifically, I wanted to see what would happen if we took fruits and suspended them into clear epoxy permanently. So this was my first prototype. It's pretty ugly, as you can see, but I made it almost 9 months ago. It's an apple. I just wanted to see what would happen. You can barely see that it's starting to rot. There's some areas that have collapsed. There's patches of white mold, but part of it actually seems to be almost in the same condition as when I put it in. Maybe a little less color, but largely still preserved for 9 or 10 months later, which is remarkable. Now with this one, I made a lot of mistakes. I learned a lot. It was my first time using epoxy, and I think we're ready to try again. So today we're going to take a strawberry and a tomato and hopefully preserve them in epoxy. The first thing I learned from the apple is that the sides absolutely have to be flat. It needs to be in a cube. If you put it in a cylinder like this, the sides are all convex and they have a magnifying effect which totally distorts the object and you can't even really tell what's going on. So, okay, yeah, great, there we go, problem solved. We'll use these cube molds for the strawberry and the tomato. The next problem is the bubbles. You can see that there's a ton of micro bubbles in the epoxy because when you mix it, it creates bubbles, they get trapped as it dries, and this is a problem. So I did some research and apparently after mixing, you need to put the resin into a vacuum chamber so that it literally sucks all of the bubbles out of the resin and you can pour it clear. But where am I going to get a vacuum chamber? Okay, yeah, this seems like it'll work. But time out, we have to talk about this vacuum chamber for a second because when you remove air molecules, crazy things start to happen. So for example, if we just take a cup of regular tap water at room temperature and put it inside the vacuum chamber for a few minutes, watch what happens. Okay, it's been about 4 minutes, and I don't know if you can see this, but the water is actually boiling. Bubbles are starting to form at the bottom. There's lots of water vapor that's escaping. So the water didn't actually heat up, it's just that without any air molecules, water will boil at room temperature, which is fascinating. Another tricky part about this is that, of course, we want the objects to float in the center, so we need to do this in 2 layers. We'll tie a string to the fruit and then tie that string to something that can hang over the top so it's just centered, and then we'll pour a shallow layer of epoxy in the bottom. Hopefully that will harden, the fruit will be locked in place, then we can remove the attachments and pour the next layer all the way to the top. Well, at least that was the idea. This was my first time using that particular brand of epoxy, and it was kind of a disaster because it seemed like it would never harden. After 24 hours, it was still sitting there with that little layer, basically still a liquid. But I had to keep going. I felt like it might be just tacky enough that it would hold the fruit in place. But after I poured that second layer, I quickly found out that the fruit didn't want to sink, it wanted to float, which kind of makes sense in retrospect. So I had to jerry-rig these popsicle sticks with screws on the other side that I could use to kind of push them down and keep them in place. At this point, I was kind of prepared for them to fail. I thought I had lost them and I'd have to start over because it was drying so slow. They kept floating to the surface, but I just kept working with them. I went back out to my garage every 20 or 30 minutes for at least 12 hours, using the blow dryer to warm the epoxy so it would harden faster, using popsicle sticks to try to push them back into place. And every time I did this, it got a little bit harder, a little more tacky, a little harder to push them into place. And eventually they did manage to set. There's definitely some bubbles and imperfections from all that movement and disturbing I had to do of the epoxy, but in the end, I think they turned out even better than I expected despite all of the challenges. And I think the imperfections actually make them even more beautiful in a way. Oh, by the way, I wanted to point out that you probably shouldn't try this at home. It might not seem like it, but it could actually be dangerous. Fruit has sugars, and there are natural yeast everywhere in our environment, including on the outside of this fruit. And if you remember from chemistry, yeast will convert sugars into three things: heat, which is not a problem, alcohol, which is not a problem, and carbon dioxide, a lot of carbon dioxide, which could be a big problem. Right now, it's encased completely in here. If the fermentation is happening, which it probably is, there's going to be a buildup of carbon dioxide. I don't know what's going to happen. It could not be anything. It could be such a small amount that nothing happens. It could be a bigger amount which expands and then goes poof, or it could be a lot, it holds its shape and then turns into a grenade. I don't want to find out, so I'm going to drill a little hole in the corner and put a 5-micron filter paper over the top with more epoxy. If you look at the other ones that I did, the apple, that one has a filter on it. It's really ugly. I'm going to try to make it prettier here, but as soon as possible, I'm going to drill a hole in this, cover it with a filter that won't let any smells or liquids in or out, but it will allow the air to flow. That's really important. But yeah, these are the epoxy fruit. I love these things. Every day they're different. In a way, they kind of strike an interesting paradox because on the one hand, they're all about preservation, but on the other hand, they're some of the most temporary works of art you could imagine because they will evolve and decay on a daily basis. The epoxy will inevitably yellow over time, and there's no way to stop these processes. Believe me, I've researched it, I've looked into it. There's no way to preserve them completely. And that's the point. They're supposed to change. In a way, they're kind of a reminder to me that life is temporary and always changing. They make me think of a quote from, I don't remember who said that we should always reflect on the fact that in 100 years, you and all of your friends and all of your enemies will all be dust. And I think if we reflected on that truth more often, then maybe, perhaps, sometimes we would make different choices or have a different perspective. And these guys are just kind of a subtle reminder of that for me. But anyways, I'll keep taking photos of them as they evolve over the next few weeks and months. And if you want to see an updated video on how they've changed over time, I can do that. So leave me a comment. Let me know if you'd like to see that. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next one.